Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is a wonderful guest known affectionately as the Kombucha Mama. She's going to be taking us to what is known as Kombucha Kamp as we discover what this delicious brew actually does for us. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Hannah Crump. Hannah, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, Daniel. Thanks.
Now, how did you get involved with the brewing of kombucha? How did this come into your life?
You know, I call it kombucha kismet. A lot of people find kombucha. They seek it out because they've heard about how beneficial it can be for the immune system and digestion. For me, I had never heard of it at all until I visited a friend from college who lived in San Francisco. And if you've ever been to San Francisco, you know it's kind of a hotbed of groovy things, although I'm sure Portland is too. And he happened to have a box of mysterious jars, and he goes, "That's the kombucha." They were jars, and they were covered with claws, and they had weird floaty things in them, and we didn't even try it, but that word just really stuck in my mind. So when I headed back to L.A., was in the early 2000s. I went to my local Whole Foods, and lo and behold, there was an entire case of kombuchas. So I walked over to the shelf, I grabbed one off, and I opened it right there in the store, and I took my first sip. Now, Daniel, do you remember your first sip of kombucha? How did that strike you?
Well, it was interesting because, it was really bubbly at first, It seemed a little bit vinegary, but overall it was actually pretty pleasant tasting, actually.
Well, and some people don't really resonate with that vinegary taste, but like you, I thought it was fantastic. And, I could feel the nutrition working in my body, and I was really excited by it. It kind of reminded me of the pickle juice I used to sneak out of the pickle jar when I was at home. My mom would always get so mad at me for doing that. She's like, "Oh, it's so salty, so bad for you." But I just really love those kind of savory, delicious flavors. And your first sip of coffee, your first sip of wine, your first sip of beer might have had a similar reaction if you can remember that long ago. And like all the finer things, it's something that grows on you.
Now, let's talk about exactly what kombucha is and how was it actually discovered in the first place?
Well, it's a fermented tea. So it's tea and sugar that then is fermented with a culture or mother. It's actually very similar to the vinegar making process, and it shares some common bacteria there as well. And so, I don't know, have you ever seen a mother of vinegar? It's like this little disc that floats at the bottom. Oh, it doesn't float. It hangs out at the bottom of the jar in a raw vinegar. So our culture looks a lot like that. It's bacterial cellulose, and it contains within it both yeast and bacteria. And so when we float that into our kombucha, like our mothership, that inoculates the brew. It lowers the pH quickly, which prevents mold and other things from growing in it. And it turns it into this light, refreshing, delicious probiotic beverage. And I know some folks are thinking, "Oh, vinegar, why would I want to drink that?" But kombucha is a very mild vinegar, so to speak. It's about 0.5% to 1%, whereas most commercial vinegars are 4 to 8% acetic acid. So it's an easy drinking vinegar, as I like to say.
Now, it's interesting because you've mentioned both yeast and bacteria. Most people listening to the program would think, well, I'm always used to trying to find ways to eliminate yeast and bacteria, so there must be something going on here that actually is beneficial when it comes to saying yeast and bacteria.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it's there's good and bad in everything, and so and more often than not, it's in what quantities. It's about balance and diversity. For instance, people think of Candida overgrowth as something that's a negative aspect. Now, Candida lives in our digestive system anyways and is supposed to be there in a small quantity in a controlled environment with a diverse microbiome. Unfortunately, when certain things occur in our life and we end up with gut dysbiosis and it ends up taking over, that's when we experience problems. And so, more often than not, by consuming healthy bacteria and healthy yeast, you help to control those populations that shouldn't be overgrown, so that way you return balance and harmony to the gut. And so I always want to emphasize, drinking kombucha is certainly an easy, quick way to start that process, but you want to get a wide variety of fermented foods in your diet, not just one.
Now, a lot of times people might go out when they understand they need to replenish the probiotics within their gut, and we've talked certainly about healing the gut here on the program, and and you have to wonder, When you go out and you buy probiotics, you can get really good high strains. It's pretty expensive, especially if you get pharmaceutical grade. How does something like kombucha measure up to something like that?
Well, here's the thing. As I mentioned before, it's about diversity. There's 500 to 1,000 different potential organisms that live in your gut, and each person's microbiome is like their fingerprint. It's completely unique. So we don't necessarily know which strains or which types are crucial for our particular organism. And, often the problem is with probiotics is they might be single strain focused, or they might just have a small diversity. Humans evolved consuming fermented foods. The fridge is a relatively new invention, being only, a couple hundred years old. How did humans survive winter and difficult conditions without food handy? Well, they had to preserve it. They had to ferment it. And it was those healthy bacteria that we consumed on a daily basis in food-sized portions that gave our microbiomes the diversity that they needed, coupled with the fact that we lived a little bit closer to earth and animals and things like that. So all of those shared their good, healthy bacteria, and it was that great diversity we created in our bodies that gave us our immunity and our immune system. And so when you return to consuming foods that are fermented, you're getting it in those food-sized doses again. You're getting it in quantities and the types of bacteria that humans have long evolved to recognize and instantly utilize. And then you're also not potentially going too far to the other side. Now we're hearing about folks who have too much acidophilus in their system because they've just been focusing on taking one type of supplement. And so whether you choose to supplement or not, you definitely want to continuously vary and be conscientious that you're getting a wide variety as opposed to focusing just on one thing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It seems that when somebody discovers something that's allegedly good for you, then, they first have to get the best and then do as much of it as possible. And you can find yourself, for instance, if you try herbal supplementation, becoming very sick doing that, and that's something you certainly want to be careful of. Now, when it comes to drinking kombucha, is there such a thing as too much?
Well, is there too much broccoli? Is there too much hamburgers, right? At a certain point, your body says, all right, I've had enough of that nutrition. I think I'm good right now. Why it is, I think, that some people, when they first come to kombucha and they have a real thirst for it, some will even say addiction, which, of course, has a negative connotation. So how we think of it is the body is lacking something. Because we're not consuming these foods on a regular basis in our current dietary, some of us are making more of an effort than others, but for the vast majority of people, it's just something that's slipped out of our consciousness because it's not really presented to us in the grocery stores. And so when they start drinking something that has this nutrition in a living form, their body's like, yes, give me more of that. I've been missing that. I really need that. And so some folks will initially have a large thirst for it, but over time, as your body rebalances, as it kind of derives the nutrition it's looking for, you'll find those cravings will slake off. And for some people, even having a little bit of kombucha is too much. And so it's really trusting your gut. And that means listening to the biofeedback your body is giving you. So here's an example. I was recently traveling. I grabbed one of those bottles of, the sauerkraut juice. It was so delicious. Well, I accidentally drank a bit too much of it, and I ended up giving myself a mini cleanse. So, your body's going to communicate with you when you've kind of gone a little too far the other direction and when it's appropriate to dial it back. And so for some folks, because they have a compromised immune system or, their gut just is out of balance, maybe consuming like a milk kefir or a water kefir is more appropriate for them until their microbiome is able to kind of rebalance a little bit and then start drinking the kombucha. So again, it's just really listening to your body to see what's right for you.
Now, in making kombucha, I discovered I actually make it myself, and I was really surprised at just how relatively easy this is. And the second thing is how amazingly fast that SCOBY grows. First of all, talk about what a SCOBY is and what it does, actually.
So the SCOBY is an acronym. It stands for Symbiotic Culture of Bacteria and Yeast, and I also referred to it as a mother earlier in the show. And so this is our cellulose pellicle. Basically, the bacteria throw out these nanofibers of cellulose, kind of like a spider just throwing out webs. And as they spin those out, other bacteria connect, and they create this skin. Well, the purpose of that is it creates a barrier. It prevents other organisms from getting to the sweet tea, which is, of course, a nutritious substrate for things like mold and other stuff that we wouldn't want in there. And so it creates, it'll always grow to the size of the vessel. So even if you start with a smaller culture, provided you have enough starter liquid and the conditions are right, your culture will grow to the size of the vessel. And that's because it's creating that lid. Now, the other thing that lid is doing is it's preventing evaporation. So it's helping to maintain that liquid as long as possible. And then it's also putting those healthy organisms into the tea and sugar, which is what kickstarts that fermentation process. Then as the layer thickens, there's an anaerobic process that occurs below the surface. And you'll often see, little air bubbles kind of collecting right at where the mother meets the liquid. And that is part of what holds in some of the carbonation in that process. And then it reproduces, so you have two at the end of it, and like I said, it's a mothership that then goes from batch to batch and inoculates new ones. And once you have extras, of course, you can share them with friends. Chickens like to eat them, humans can eat them. There's all kinds of great uses for them as well.
Now, it's really, interesting when something like this comes on the horizon because, for instance, you might have people making a lot of claims about the benefits that they've experienced, and who's to actually question, a person's experience. However, the fact is this does a lot more, it seems, than just help balance the digestive system. But I understand there are things such as detoxing the liver. Is this true?
It is. Some of the healthy acids created by the elements in the SCOBY in conjunction with the tea. So, remember this, tea is already incredibly healthy. It's something that numerous studies have shown helps with anti-cancer, anti-cholesterol, weight management. So a lot of the benefits that people say they get from kombucha are also echoed from those who consume tea on a regular basis. Now, also remember vinegar. Vinegar has also been touted as a health tonic that helps with, lowering cholesterol and doing a lot of beneficial things. So you're marrying these two together in a more palatable form, and then this glucuronic acid is created. So we also create that in our livers naturally, and what it does is when toxic molecules enter the body, and your liver is your filter. So before we pass anything into the bloodstream, after the digestive system breaks it down, it goes through the liver. So things like caffeine, alcohol, prescription drugs, stuff like that all gets processed by the liver in order to prevent toxifying the blood. Now, once those toxins come into contact with the glucuronic acid, they create a bond that can't be broken. And so through hydrolysis or drinking water, you're then able to flush them out of the system. But when we're overexposed to toxins, such as the world we live in right now, where there's pollution in the air and the water and the food and the beauty products, we're literally inundated right now with chemicals, your liver can't keep up. And so those end up being bioaccumulated in your fat, and over time, that's part of what leads to getting sick, is because you just have too many toxins in your body. And so when you drink something that has these acids present, you're like cleaning the filter. So imagine that gunky, old, yucky filter now gradually over time being, cleaned out. It makes a lot of sense why people say, hey, it's just making me feel good. And then, of course, any of the ailments connected to the liver and how sugar is processed with the liver, of course, are going to be improved. So diabetics, people with cholesterol issues, often find that, I won't say everybody, because everybody is different, but often find that it has a positive effect on these specific ailments.
Now, in the time that you have been involved with kombucha, that is both brewing it yourself as well as teaching others, and of course authoring a couple of really nice books, including the Big Book of Kombucha, have you known of anybody to have any really negative effects from using kombucha?
Severely immunocompromised folks might have a reaction that's unpleasant, but there's been no known nobody's actually died from drinking kombucha, which, considering its long history, is a pretty good track record. In fact, there was an FDA scientist who wrote, there's never been any death attributed to a fermented food product. So, we think that it's something that any healthy immune system can enjoy. But again, because we live in a time when so many people are really sick, that's why we need to exercise caution. But what typically happens is what's called a Herxheimer reaction, and so this happens anytime you start a detox protocol, potentially. And what that is as the toxins are re-released in the body on their way out, they may cause something like a light fever, a little bit of a rash. It shouldn't be too intense. If you're experiencing something that's really uncomfortable and intense, it's probably your body saying, you know what, let's slow down here. This is more than I can handle right now. And that's why having different types of fermented foods, like the yogurts or the sauerkrauts or the milk kefir, things like that, might be the better approach initially until there's a little more balance returned to the body, and then go ahead with the detoxification part.
Now, because you actually feed the SCOBY, as we talked about earlier, the mother, if you will, it's a sweetened tea drink. That's the food that they have here. What about people who might be, or who are diabetic?
Well, so it's actually shown to really help diabetics, because what happens is the sugar's not for you. So even though you're using 1 cup of sugar per gallon, it gets fermented by the yeast and the bacteria. So the yeast break it down into ethanol and CO2, which are your bubbles. Then the bacteria consume the glucose, and that's what makes the glucuronic acid. The fructose is also utilized by the yeast. And, if you ferment it long enough, and we always recommend folks who have sugar-sensitive ailments do ferment it longer, it's going to have a tangier flavor. More of those healthy acids will be present, and it'll have a lower glycemic load when you consume it. And so just anecdotally, people have written in and said, hey, I can lower the amount of insulin I'm taking and this and that. Of course, we're not doctors. We're not recommending this to anyone. But the reason why we're ever motivated to study anything through the scientific method is because the phenomena already exists. So I think it does warrant looking at what are people's experiences when they consume it, not assuming that you'll have that exact same experience, but using it somewhat as a guide to what is potentially available. And then there's quite a bit of research that has been done on kombucha. I know many people say, oh, there isn't any research. The reality is it just isn't being done in the U.S. But, we're about to launch a research database on Kombucha Kamp that's going to have 200 papers all discussing different aspects of how it has been researched. And many of the papers show that in rats or in vitro and in different studies that it does lean towards having these positive benefits that people have been claiming it has for, hundreds, thousands of years.
This is all, it was fascinating when I came across it. Actually, it was about a year ago, and then I just happened to know someone, and she says, yeah, I've actually got it. I'll give you a piece of SCOBY to deal with here. And as I got that, I was, again, really amazed at how quickly this thing grows. I'm brewing now an average of about 5 gallons a month. Mm-hmm. And it's incredible to think, because you go out and if you actually buy it, it can be pretty spendy by the bottle. Now, here's my question about that, though. Compared to what I brew, compared to what you buy, how come it seems to be so much higher in carbonation when you buy it?
Well, sometimes folks are force carbing. It's not one of the things you have to put on the label. Consumers have an expectation, and so, manufacturers try to meet that expectation. I'm not saying every single brand does that, and you can typically tell by observing the bubbles. If the bubbles are uniform in size and pop at a similar rate, then it's probably forced carbonation. If they're soft and some are large and some are small and they're popping at different rates, and that's going to be natural effervescence, so to speak. But, that's the difficulty of a commercial product versus a homebrewed product. At home, you have so much control over the process, and, you sometimes drink the failures along with the successes. When it comes to a commercial product, because people are spending their money on it, they have a certain expectation of quality every time. And so, that then forces manufacturers to have to do different things in order to meet expectations in that way.
It's also fascinating. I think what's also fantastic about kombucha is how you can actually infuse it with flavors, including fresh fruits. Talk about how that works.
Absolutely. Well, again, we've talked about its vinegar-like properties. Vinegar is fantastic at extracting nutrition from whatever you're infusing into it. That's how we made a lot of our tonics and herbal remedies and such. And so a little bit goes a long way, whether that's fruit or ginger or herbs. You put a little bit in the bottle. You give it a couple of days at room temperature. That just allows the flavor, the colors, almost instantly. Like when I put blueberries in there, it just starts to turn purple. So all that anthocyanin, all that good stuff is being pulled into the kombucha. So then when you consume it, you also derive the nutritional benefit of whatever you've infused into it. And in the book, we have 260 flavoring suggestions, including some really wacky ones like the savory stuff, the mushrooms and the bacon. And, there's also some special herbal blends, some inspired by Ayurveda or traditional Chinese medicine. So, of course, whenever you're working with herbs, you want to do so cautiously, but things like ginger and ginseng have a really beneficial effect on the human body, and you can play with those.
Well, it's certainly interesting to note that you just mentioned bacon, so it seems truly bacon makes anything taste good.
Well, again, some people would think that's a weird flavor for kombucha because they're used to the fruity, sweeter ones. But again, that vinegar aspect, it works really well. And we have a couple of different kombucha cocktails in the book, and one of them is a porcini. So you can make that bacon kombucha and a little bit of maple syrup instead of simple syrup, and just create a really fun, crafty cocktail.
Now, I'm sure a lot of times when people come across this, too, they get really excited about what they would consider to be curing things. But the fact is this doesn't cure anything, and it's certainly not a panacea. But what it helps to do, as you even say it here on your website, it helps the body to balance. It gives the body the kind of nutrients that it needs, so the body will naturally balance itself. And you think, it's pretty amazing if we just take care of our bodies in some cases, in some of the simplest ways, the kind of things that can almost border on what seem to be health miracles.
Absolutely, and you're hitting the nail on the head in that we are nature. And what is, when you give nature its appropriate inputs, it thrives. That is nature. Nature wants to thrive. The weeds growing up in the cracks. It finds any way to survive, and we are cut from that very same cloth. And it's just unfortunate that we live in a current culture and society where folks are allowed to put weird chemicals into things, and they don't even have to label it properly for anybody to know exactly what they're consuming. And then you also consider how the food supply has been squeezed down to these these commoditized crops, corn and soybeans and things like that. And, the reality is people are sensitive to them because we're designed to consume small amounts of a wide variety of foods. And so when you've got the high fructose corn syrup and the cows are eating the corn and, all these different things going on, what happens is your diet becomes very mono-focused in terms of what you're eating, and this is where a lot of these sensitivities are coming from. And again, it's like refocusing back on quality over quantity, because the reality is, even if you spend a little bit more money for a quality food, you won't need to eat as much of it because it's more nutrient dense. And so it's trading out. It's starting to make those different choices and different substitutes. And the reality is we can grow so much of our own food too, depending on your climate. Everyone's got a growing season. And so kind of getting back into connecting with the earth and connecting with these healthier food sources is really our, salvation. It's how we have existed for so long. And it's because we're in this weird bubble in time that so many illnesses are present.
Now, it's interesting because bacteria is one of the main components of kombucha here. And there was a guest that I had on the show probably about 6 months ago, and he wrote a nice fun little series of small books called The Kitchen Sink Farmer. And it's his whole idea. You can learn to be self-sustaining where you really wouldn't need to buy food in the store and be healthier than you've ever imagined. And plus, it's enjoyable to be involved in what you're doing. And one of the things he talks about is bacteria at a fair length. He says, you got to take a look. Bacteria is how life started. Are you possibly going to believe after billions of years of evolution that somehow humans have found a way to outsmart something like that?
Human hubris is what I call it. I mean, anytime someone says the science is settled, you better believe that's not true. I mean, look, we didn't understand blood types. People would be given blood transfusions, they die. We didn't understand doctors needed to wash their hands after dealing with cadavers before delivering babies. I mean, sanitation practices, right? There's so many things that we just haven't really understood, and it's somewhat magical when you start to understand. I mean, it's science, it's bacteria, but our guts are made of the same tissue as our brains, but it has far more neurotransmitters, and so those gut feelings you get is that your bacteria communicating with you. Bacteria communicate through quorum sensing. Are they sensing someone else's bacteria and they're sending you messages to give you information for your survival? Are we going to, I think then if we also start to view the world through a bacterial lens, we can see, well, there's some very parasitic and pathogenic systems and institutions that exist out there. But it's because we allow our organism to be weak, for our bacterial force field to be depleted, that we then don't have the energy to deprive those things of their ability to exist. But by their very nature, pathogens and are weak, because if they were so dominant, we'd all already be dead. And so I feel that what that does is it re-empowers us at that individual level. So that if we're conscientious that, petting a dog and hugging a friend and, letting a baby slobber on you, all of these things are really crucial for improving your biome. And then just like the bacteria in our culture, we need these connections. We need to come together in community. We need to create a biofilm, a SCOBY, so to speak, and say, hey, you know what, we're not going to let you just poison our food supply. We're not going to let you poison the water here. This is unethical, it's inappropriate, and it doesn't allow for the vast diversity of organisms to thrive. But it's going to come from the bottom. It's got to be a groundswell because, as we already know, it's not going to come from the top. Too many folks have a financial investment in the policies and how they're made. And, so it's going to have to come from the individuals voting with their dollars. If that's all that, this society or culture is willing to listen to, then that's where our power is.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And it's interesting when you begin to empower yourself to learn these things. For instance, my wife has a philosophy that you should develop a new skill every 6 months. When you start getting involved in something like this, I noticed how enjoyable it was. And people look at a SCOBY and they might not think it's the most attractive looking thing in the world, but as this is really doing its thing, as you're watching it through the jar, I find it fascinating to realize what I'm really watching here is a living organism, thriving, and in knowing that you're actually giving life and promoting it, you realize just how exciting doing something like this can actually be.
Absolutely, and I think that, while they look weird at first, people they love their SCOBYs. They talk to them, they play nice music for them, they put crystals around, there's a relationship that comes up, and I can't tell you how much I love going into the farm and just sitting there quietly, and then all of a sudden you'll start to hear it. You'll hear the boop, 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 boop as the little bubbles are popping up, and it's like they're talking to you. And I realize that some people out there who don't experience this might think it's strange, but there really is a connection and a relationship that develops with your cultures, and whenever you're culturing food, there's just an excitement about how you made this, and there's a vital ingredient that is included when we do things on our own, and that's love. Love nourishes the soul. Love helps to provide a nutrition that we inherently need, and it's one of those things that when you have a faceless factory creating products for faceless consumers, it simply doesn't exist there. And that's why supporting your local farmer, supporting the local person in your community who's making the food but maybe charges a little bit more for it is so vital, because that's truly what this country was built on, was people coming over here, whether they had a farm or a store or whatever, making it happen in their communities. And I think if we return to that, a lot more people are employed in a way that really supports them and their families, and the community thrives as a result.
That's absolutely true, and I like that you keep saying it's up to the individual to empower themselves and quit waiting for a government or somebody else to come along and save them and protect them, when you can actually be doing a lot of these things yourself. You don't like GMOs in your food? Then what are you going to do, other than try to wait for somebody to pass a bill that won't allow that to happen anymore? Are you going to wait for that?
Right.
And, it's fortunate living in Portland, Oregon, because you have so many, organic, sustainable farms. In fact, most restaurants now have converted to that, where they're getting away from mass suppliers to where they're getting local, organically grown food, and it's that's probably why the restaurants thrive so well here, is because people can really feel and taste the difference and what they're enjoying, and it's pretty incredible stuff. Now, I wanted you to, if you could, for our listeners, go ahead and guide them to your website. I know it's quite extensive talking about this, but first I'd like to know, have you ever known of any kind of negative reaction from the medical or scientific community against kombucha? Because it seems like whenever something natural comes up, all of a sudden they're saying, well, that's all nonsense.
Well, and you're absolutely right. You go to the Mayo Clinic website, and it's like, oh, beware, it's dangerous, or only buy commercial brands. Like, somehow this, product that started on people's countertops is
right.
is less safe if you make it at home. It's kind of silly. You definitely see that coming up, and that's truly where the genesis of KombuchaKamp.com, and that's Camp with a K, because I'm cute and clever, came from was a desire to educate. Our mission has always been to educate people, to empower them through information and knowledge so that they could develop a skill set for themselves. And so if you go to kombuchakamp.com, you'll find we have loads of articles, information, research that's just there for free. And then, out of that, our quality information, we then wanted to provide quality supplies. And so we're bacteria farmers. We use all organic ingredients. We use, fluoride-free water. So everything we do is done to the utmost care. And while it's absolutely great to get a culture from a friend, if you simply don't have someone who come to us. It's a small investment for a lifetime of benefit. And then from there, we have quality support. So it's not like you find it off of Craigslist and now you don't know who to turn to with your questions. And am I poisoning myself? Is this safe to drink? Right? You can always drop an email to customer service at kombuchakamp.com. We answer every single email because we want people to understand this is something that's really safe and easy to do. And of course, if something looks untoward, we're going to help you out with that. So quality information, quality supplies, quality support. Really, from this culture, we've learned that healthy boundaries is so crucial to developing a healthy culture. And so treating people with respect, treating our products with respect, that's really the backbone of what we do as a small family business.
And it certainly seems like your mission, as well as us bringing you here on the radio program, is to get people to start respecting themselves and the decisions they make and to be able to count on the fact that you can make good decisions. You don't need to go to a doctor or government official to do something like that. Just get out there and learn that new skill, develop it, talk with like-minded others. And I like that you said this is something that is a lifetime, and you'll discover that as you decide to go this direction and perhaps brew your own kombucha, the biggest problem you're going to have is what to do with all the dadgum scobies.
Right.
These things are, in fact, it was funny. I was just showing my wife an original Star Trek episode. It was the one with those little weird rubber discs down on the planet. One of them landed on Spock, and I said, see, that's the SCOBY. I think that's where this actually came from here. But there were, a bunch of those. I wonder what would happen if you put one of those into a brew. But the fact is they just keep growing and growing and growing. And interestingly enough, on your website, you talk about what to do with those extras, put them in a hotel
Absolutely.
or put them into a bread. You're like,
right.
Wow.
Well, and, we're tip of the iceberg with this technology here. NASA sent scobies out into space. I don't know if you've seen some of the videos of different universities.
No, I haven't heard of scobies in space. Muppets maybe, but not scobies.
Well, the reason for it is, of course, they're helping to keep people's bacterial balance in place, but also you can create fibers out of this cellulose. And so many universities are now trying to develop fabric out of the kombucha cultures. You have to kind of tan it like a hide because it's very hydrophilic, meaning it absorbs water. But if you can tan it like a hide, you've got a vegan leather substitute, and you've got a renewable resource. Also, it's been shown to speed healing in wounds and burns and things like that. So some folks have developed this culture into bandages. It's also a similar bacteria is also being grown and turned into face masks because it helps to bring circulation to the surface of the skin, which is what regenerates the skin cells. It also has that mild acid to slough off dead skin cells. So, there's so many things that we still don't even know this culture is capable of. And because it's so easy to even grow it from, waste streams, I'm excited to see where we're going to end up with this SCOBY technology. It can also be fed to animals. Chickens instinctively fight over the SCOBYs. They have no idea what it is, but everyone wants their SCOBY. And, so whether this becomes a probiotic animal feed supplement that then eliminates the use of all these antibiotics or reduces it greatly, there's so many things that we think this could be beneficial for. Imagine if hospitals were brewing their own kombucha and creating their own sanitizer out of it, because bacteria is like controls like, bactericides aren't really effective long term because the bacteria that then survive, because some of them will, that DNA gets passed on and then they're able to evolve and mutate into, superbugs. But if you have healthy bacteria controlling other bacteria, holding them in check, those microbial communities aren't allowed to thrive. And so, I have a very different vision of what the future could potentially be, but, there's a lot of programming, there's a lot of propaganda, and so I understand why people feel like they're victims to our culture, and it's because our culture very much sends that message of, mass consumption of things you don't actually need, distracting your mind from the true things that are valuable, and it leaves a lot of people feeling distraught and isolated.
Well, not to mention the final touch on that we've certainly talked a lot about here on the program is the message that we know better about you than you do.
Right.
Yes. And it's like, no, you need to put that nonsense away and start counting on yourself, as you were talking about earlier. And this is one of those fun ways, get your kids involved, and it's kind of a fun science project with a really great outcome.
Absolutely, yeah. That's one of our future goals. Obviously, we wrote the book. We hope it's a fun textbook, something that people can refer to again and again. Even if you don't ever decide to make kombucha, there's so much history and the research section in the back with the appendix talking about the symptom-specific benefits. We just think it's a really fun book for anyone who's even curious about kombucha to get into. But our goal, of course, is to create curriculum for all those levels, because whether you're homeschooling or whether you're in a science class at school, this is something that's so easy to work with and to observe, and you can take and look at it under the microscope, all the way up to the college level where, look, wine and beer have been studied for hundreds of years in a research way. We simply haven't done that with kombucha, but I expect as it becomes more popular that we will start to see, just out of sheer curiosity, more and more people wanting to study this, wanting to understand it. And of course, we're so lucky right now, Daniel, that the human microbiome has taken so much center stage, and really this bacterial information is so vital for us to even understanding who we are as human beings and how this world works, because everything has to do with bacteria. And like you were saying before, we have these millions, billions of years of evolution built into our DNA. There's a lot of wisdom that we contain within ourselves. It's just we have to remember how to listen to that so that we can do what's best for our specific organisms. I hate dietary labels. I hate all these like, oh, I eat this, oh, I eat that. It's like, eat what makes your body feel good in that moment. And so if that means you're eating 20% meat or 5% meat or whatever that might be, varying those things and finding the variables that work best for you.
Very good. Hannah, it's been a real pleasure to have you here on the program today to talk about this wonderful drink and, of course, all the other things that we were talking about here as well. Before you go, though, you'll give out that website one more time, but I'm sure that we could probably really volley in Congress to create a National SCOBY Day. What do you think?
I love that idea. I think that would be a lot of fun. But, kombuchakamp.com, that's where you're going to find all of our information and tips. And then, I don't know, we haven't mentioned it yet, but out of our passion for changing the world one gut at a time, which is our mission at Kombucha Kamp, in 2014 we also founded Kombucha Brewers International. So this is the only nonprofit trade association supporting the commercial industry around the world. We started with 40 companies then. We're over 140 now. So it's just a testament to how quickly this industry is growing. And it's an industry of small family businesses, of people who had a health challenge. Kombucha helped. They were so inspired they wanted to help their community. So if you are interested in taking your home brewing to another level or want to find out what brands are local to you, come check out kombuchabrewers.org as well. And, and check out the book, too, the Big Book of Kombucha. You can find it all over Amazon and other places like that.
Exciting stuff. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us here on the program today and sharing this wonderful thing for our audience.
Thank you, Daniel. Really great to be here.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can also discover more by visiting beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We'll have some links there for you to be able to discover this wonderful way that you might be able to change your life just one little sip at a time. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. Remember, live your day past halfway.